In this segment, I want to talk about freedom of expression, and most particularly the form of freedom of expression called freedom of the press. We've already discussed freedom of expression early in the course as a part of the general principles of democracy. It is essential in a constitutional democratic system that every individual have the right to express themselves. In the words of John Stuart Mill, whose language actually has been incorporated in some Supreme Court decisions, if all of mankind were of one opinion and only one person were of a contrary opinion, that all of mankind would have no more right to silence that one person than that one person, if he were, say, king of the world, would be able to silence all of mankind. Freedom of expression is an individual right. But having stated it as a general principle is not the same as stating it as an operational principle. How do you make that principle operational? And that's where the additional provisions in the Constitution become so terribly important. In general, I have two observations to make. Freedom of expression is a freedom of words and a freedom of thought, but it is not a freedom of action. If someone were to say, I have a right to commit murder, they would have a right to say that, but they would not have a right to do that. The ability to say the words is different than the action to be taken. One step further. If those words are used in such a way as to constitute an action that threatens, then they also, like an action, can be prohibited. So, in a case called the Chaplinsky case, if you use swear words or fighting words, there are cases in which you can be silenced and punished for using fighting words, swear words, condemnation words, because those words become an action. And if you use your words to defame another person in writing, that's called libel. And after the fact, you can be held responsible for defamation of character statements that are false after the fact. You may also, under free speech, despite the provision of free speech, if you use your words to defame another person orally, after you've said those words, you can be held accountable or responsible for the damage done to someone else's reputation. The words in these cases have become, in effect, actions, and the actions can be restrained. Now, in that last formulation, I use a reference to after the fact, and that leads us to the second general principle that applies to all free expression issues. That's the principle of no prior restraint. The principle of no prior restraint is a common law principle that predates the United States. It had existed under Anglo-Saxon law in Great Britain prior to the founding of the United States. It had been incorporated, in fact, in Blackstone's commentary on the law as early as 1756. And Blackstone was adamant that the key principle of press and speech, and assembly as well, was that there should be no prior restraint on people. So we're going to take a look at the prior restraint issues as they bear on freedom of the press. In an earlier segment, I discussed the Alien Sedition Acts. The Alien Sedition Acts are the principal case, probably the only really important case, in which the federal government sought to restrain free speech or free press by declaring it to be sedition, to defame public officials in the United States. It had a short and unpleasant history. It was passed in the administration of John Adams and repealed in the administration of Thomas Jefferson. And after that, the federal government did nothing to pass sedition acts, leaving the whole issue alone. Now, of course, that didn't mean there was free speech, press, or assembly, because the states could still take action, and they often did. That's the importance of the selective incorporation discussion we had. But if we go from the history of the United States, from the Alien Sedition Act, you have to wait all the way until 1930 before you begin to get cases in which the United States faced up to the issue of free press. In 1930, Oscar Neer, Mr. Neer from Minneapolis and St. Paul, published a little newsletter in which he defamed the city government. The state of Minnesota took action against Neer. That was overturned by the Supreme Court because his right to press was protected by the First Amendment as it was selectively incorporated under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. But it's critical that in the issue of Neer versus Minnesota, what made it wrong to stop Mr. Neer's paper was that it was a prior restraint. The state of Minnesota banned Mr. Neer from publishing another edition of the newspaper. It was not, as it might have been, an action against Mr. Neer because the person who he defamed sought to sue him for libel. Of course, they didn't want to do that. Mr. Neer had no money, so suing him for libel was pointless. But that's the distinction. The distinction is that Neer could publish whatever he wanted to and was subject only to civil penalties, lawsuits for damages, after the fact. The same principle applied in another important case in American history. That case occurred in 1971 and is known generally by the title the Pentagon Papers case. The issues in the Pentagon Papers case came out of the Vietnam War. A man named Daniel Ellsberg had been a high-level analyst in the Defense Department under the administration of Lyndon Johnson. In that capacity, in the Defense Department, he had been commissioned by the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, to do a history of the involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. In the course of that, Mr. Ellsberg found documents that he believed established that the United States had behaved improperly in that war. That in fact we had provoked actions, not been unprovoked victims. A critical step in the American military involvement was a reputed attack in which the North Vietnamese patrol boats had sailed near two American destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. And it was alleged they'd fired machine guns at these two destroyers. No evidence of bullet holes was ever found, but the Maddox and the Turner Joy were in international waters. They were harassed by these torpedo boats. That was enough for the Congress of the United States to pass a resolution authorizing Lyndon Johnson to use force in Southeast Asia, which he did. And that led to the direct military involvement of the United States. Among the documents that Ellsberg found were documents that showed that the Maddox and Turner Joy, while they were alleged to have been attacked in international waters, had in fact been inside of the domestic waters, inside the protected zone around North Vietnam. And they had been there acting as military escorts for South Vietnamese boats as they attacked North Vietnam. An unhappy fact if you were trying to claim that the South Vietnamese were being attacked by North Vietnam. And a similarly unhappy fact if you were trying to say that we were neutral when we were not. But that's the kind of fact that Ellsberg found. Ellsberg, as an act of personal conscience, decided that even though these were top secret documents, and even though he knew that it was wrong to release top secret documents, and even though he knew that he had signed a separate pledge as an employee of something called the Rand Corporation, not to give top secret documents to people who didn't have a top secret security clearance, made copies of some 3,000 pages of top secret documents and turned them over to the New York Times. The New York Times reviewed the documents in their own independent review, as a newspaper might, and reached the conclusion that these were important documents that needed to be brought to the attention of the American people. And so in June of 1971, they began publishing them in the Sunday edition of the New York Times.